Okay. Well, hello again.
Hello, Alberto. Good to see you again.
I'm here today with Professor Gaetano Fiorin. He teaches linguistics here at University College Utrecht.
Yeah.
And we're actually repeating this conversation. I had a major breakdown in my computer, just one of those lessons that you have to back everything up. And I actually lost the file where we had the previous recording. So we're going to be treading a bit over the same points that we talked in that conversation, but neither of us remembered it perfectly.
Thankfully, exactly. We don't remember very well what we said last time, which is very good, so we can be a little more spontaneous.
Yeah. I remember we talked about something that I think was maybe the most interesting part of our conversation, which was that you were describing this relationship between linguistics, which has many areas,
Yes.
phonetics, about the sounds, semantics, about meaning, and we were talking about meaning and basically what meaning means.
Yes,
so,
yes.
What can you say about that? Maybe as
Yes. Maybe
as an introduction to the
we
theme.
can start from that, perhaps in a very general sense. So, as you already said, when we think about language, we can think about language under many, many different guises. Of course, it's very easy to see how language is a multidimensional phenomenon. As you said, there's the aspect of sound, but in general, there is the aspect of, we should call it, of the form. Let's not forget that, after all, language can be expressed in many different ways, not only by talking, but, for example, by signing, as we find in the sign language, but also by writing, for example. It's something that is nowadays, I don't know, perhaps even more common than talking. It is to type and write, for example. So on the one hand, we have the form, but on the other hand, we have, of course, one can look at language from the perspective of language as a communicative tool, how it allows to pass on and provide information. One can also look at it as a behavioral fact, something that we do and perform with one another, if not sometimes also alone. One can look at it structurally in terms of what are the formal properties of how we combine words together into units, into larger units. And one aspect that I always found very interesting since the very beginning of my approach to linguistics was that of meaning. That is, language undeniably allows us to say things, to communicate something, to express something. And I'm willingly using very informal terms, just to point to the fact that one can ask the question, what is it, this thing? That we have an intuition of communicating, of transferring, of transmitting. I like to trust, for example, that when I talk to you, Alberto, right now, I'm making these sounds, probably not very pleasant after a class today, but I'm making these sounds.
Your voice is always pleasant.
Oh,
that accent is very good.
You're very kind. But the reason I do this, I make these sounds with my nose, is because I really am convinced, and I like to think that they mean something to you and to the listeners beyond the sounds themselves, that there is some sort of reality, abstract or concrete or whatever, that is communicated. So one question I always found interesting is, what is it? If anything, of course, what is this thing? What is behind this intuition?
Well, to me, that feels pretty obvious that you're transmitting some meaning to me. And I mean, when I say to someone, here's an apple, for me, it's very clear that the meaning is not only being transmitted, but it's quite obvious what is being transmitted. So what?
Yes.
Why would you think that this is not happening?
Well, because some people thought so. That's the reason why. I tend to agree very much with you, and maybe I'm too much of a layman on this. So that's really the same intuition I share with you, of course. But some very, very eminent thinkers in the course of the history of philosophy and in general reflecting on language, some people have come up with the idea that maybe meaning is an illusion. It is an epiphenomenon. It is a product of something that is more primitive. I can think of two for example, such thinkers. One of was Ferdinand de Saussure, which for us linguists these days really represents somehow the founder of the modern way of looking at language, Ferdinand de Saussure. He had this idea that language is, that meaning is an emergent property of the grammatical structure of language. It was the first to identify language as a formal system, as a structure, in fact. Is the father, after all, of structuralism, which is a philosophy, an idea, a model that perhaps had even more success outside of linguistics. But he was the first to really look at language as a structure, as a complex system, and he wanted to derive meaning as a function of that complexity somehow, so to derive it as a byproduct of that.
I've heard about this idea of emergent property, just to go through that before we continue with the conversation. One context in which I've heard about it is that, for instance, traffic is an emergent property of everyone wanting to get home as fast as
Absolutely,
possible. Right?
That's a very nice example.
It's kind of the result of many individual things coming together, and then this thing happens that it's kind of more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah,
right?
In a sense, you can really see these I mean, the idea that some things can be analyzed as emergent properties, after all, it's an idea that has always been around one way or another, and has always been applied to very different domains, from physics to society. And it's really an idea of the balance between the individual in a system, what belongs to the individual and is unique and idiosyncratic to that individual. And by individual, I really mean an individual node in a network of relations. And what instead is part of the fact that this individual, this node, is part of a set of relations. In the social sciences, I guess, this is probably a very interesting question for debate, how much we are who we are because we are so individually, or much we are who we are because we are part of a larger group of other individuals. And the same you can ask for language. How much of the meaning of the words we utter, is it an idiosyncratic property of those words, and how much is it just a function of the relations these words have with one another? And it's interesting because the other thinker that tried to get rid of the notion of meaning altogether famously was the late Wittgenstein, who proposed instead that we should look at language not in as much as a system to express meaning, but rather as a simple action. So what really is valuable of language is not understanding what it means, but rather we should look, in his mind, we should look at the effect it produces on the environment in which it is used as an action. So for him, the only value of language is really the effect it produces. If you want to use a terminology from logic, it's more about the a posteriori effect that it produces, rather than on some a priori definition that we have on what meaning, the meaning of a certain linguistic act could be. And interesting, again, for Wittgenstein, the meaning becomes a product of the human relations between the speakers, of the actions they perform, and the effects they want to induce in one another.
I feel like on a philosophical level, I can get the point.
Yes.
But I have just this example that for me makes
Go
things
ahead.
a bit complicated, which
Yes.
is many times it's hard for you to wrap your head around an idea or a concept or something like that. And there's this sense that it is not clear from the language what it means. And often you have to, you read a few things and you read a few books or something, and then you go back to reading something, and now you can understand it. So the sense is as though the meaning was always there, and you couldn't really access it because you didn't have the tools.
Yes. Well, in what you say, there are at least two things that I largely share with you. One is an intuition that I must say I've also always had, that is that this type of understanding of meaning, the one we just discussed, in which we try to get rid somehow of the notion of meaning itself, these approaches are very abstract, and it's very difficult to understand more concretely what they mean. In fact, I always shared that intuition, and I want to say something concrete about this. In effect, both these paradigms were quite unsuccessful when it came to empirical research in linguistics. For example, when Wittgenstein formulated these ideas about meaning, he was really formulating them. Let's put it this way. It's not surprising that at the time he formulated these ideas, in fact, very similar ideas were formulated in the domain of psychology about the way language functions and especially the way language is learned. And we know nowadays that these ideas were not correct, in fact, not because for philosophical reasons, but for practical ones. We know, for example, that language is not learned, or at least not all of language that we learn as children when we learn our native languages, one or more native languages. It is quite clear that a large chunk of that knowledge is not acquired by mechanisms of response from the environment. We approach language learning with a cognitive, already endowed with a cognitive machinery that is very powerful, very complex as well, that really guides us in a way that, in fact, allows us to explain this extraordinary way in which we learn language as young kids. And in fact, we fail to do that later on in life. We do that with a capacity which we find quite constantly across very different cultures and modes of interaction with children, for example, across very different languages. No matter what, a child would always learn his or her native language or languages with absolute efficiency in a very short span of time, if you think about it, and can very easily apply the same procedure to a number of languages. In fact, multilingualism is the standard across language speakers around the world. So that cannot be. It cannot be that language is just a response from an environment, basically. So in practice, those ideas never really worked. And the same goes for the Saussure. We could make a similar argument. But the other thing I wanted to touch upon what you said is that there is an intuition that perhaps incorrect at the end of the story, but certainly it's an intuition that requires us to reflect upon, is that meaning is something we grasp. There is something to meaning that has to do with our capacity to entertain it, to be able to make it a psychological object somehow, something that helps us construct our epistemology of the world, something that provides us knowledge of a reality that lies beyond the language itself. As you say, the example you used is very beautiful in this respect. You read a very difficult text, maybe from your textbook, and you go over it over and over again, and it doesn't mean much at first, but then you start understanding, then you start grasping. Language really seems not to be the meaning itself, but rather really a vehicle that you use to connect to something else. And this is the idea that meaning really transcends language. Meaning is something that is beyond the language. And this is perhaps the strongest argument we can make against, the strongest philosophical argument, theoretical, let's say, argument we can make against these views, in fact.
I think another here you could make the point, but an interesting idea that could also maybe subvert that is other uses of language where the meaning is just completely different. If you say, I don't know, poetry, music, then
yes,
you can add a bunch of layers that just make even though you're keeping the formal structure equal, then you're still changing the meaning just because of how you're using it. But maybe there you are changing the structure. So
no. I mean, I'm more and more convinced, and especially with time passing, I'm more and more convinced that, as I already said, language and meaning itself, as language is a multidimensional phenomenon, we said, so it's meaning. There's no doubt. And there's no doubt that a lot of what this thinker said is correct. The point for me is that it's never the whole story. So obviously there is a part of language, of meaning, that is determined by its use. So yes, Wittgenstein was right. An important part of meaning has to do with the use we make of the language. And it's also very true that a large part of meaning is determined by structure. It's true. The meaning of what we say is not only a function of the words we utter, but also of the way we structure them together. So Saussure was right. But none of them was right in describing the whole, in giving us a complete answer of what meaning could be. What I'm interested in, you could say, is really to identify, to try at least. It's a quest that, of course, who knows if will ever lead to something. But the quest I'm interested in is really what is that core, what is left of meaning when we have, understood its interaction with the context, its interaction with the grammar, all of that. What remains? What is that meaningful core?
It's really interesting how once you once you compare many theories on whatever, in this case we're talking about meaning, it's so often the case that you find that everyone is sort of right in a sense, and the strangest part is when you find a contradiction and then both seem to be right. But I've noticed that, for instance, I had philosophy class for the first semester. I had never taken philosophy.
Yes.
And I just felt like every author was right about something.
Yes.
Just deeply right about something important. And yeah, it's curious how once you open your mind to once you become kind of divorced from one specific theory, right? That maybe you like a lot. Everything seems, you can find so much wisdom in just at least bits and pieces of so many different things.
Yes. Well, what I can tell you on this is that, again, this is maybe a bit of maturity that came thanks to the years passing. But one thing I learned is that I'm really more and more convinced of the fact that we live in a world that is of extreme complexity, and of which we know only a very little yet. We know a lot, but still there remains so much to be learned out there. So I'm really an advocate of taking the patience for learning and understanding before making a judgment, in fact. And I think this process is incredibly useful. One thing I like to do, I do it very often, is whenever I encounter a thinker or someone who has very different ideas from the one I'm developing, I really like to spend the time to read it and understand it and really go into that, and even if necessary to put myself in those shoes, in a sense, become what would I think if I were a supporter of that view? What reason would make me think of that? And generally, this is a process that I find extremely rewarding. You don't find the solution at the end of it, but you find wisdom for sure. You find the knowledge of the domain of your question that you couldn't have had otherwise. So it's really a message I would like many students to get these days, to be honest, in fact, which is, even before, it's true that we encourage you to think critically, to make up your own mind, but do make sure that you always take the time to listen first and to spend the effort and the time it takes to understand first. There's so much to be gained from that practice.
Yeah, I think politically it's very important, because you often get a sense that just in common conversation and even more in debate, when people feel like they have to take a stance, as though everything is obvious, that the solution to X or Y problem is obvious and it is this.
In a world where nothing is, if you ask me.
Yeah, exactly. And that exercise, I've noticed the same thing. That once you say, okay, this person is not an idiot. They have some reason for believing this, and it is a good reason. They are holding on to some truth, and that's what's leading them to believe this. And you look for that. So often you find that truth, and then you can just incorporate it into what you believe, and it doesn't destroy everything. It transforms things. And
absolutely.
It allows you to have a conversation.
Absolutely.
With common ground, and then you so often find that it's not the middle ground, because
No.
conceptually the middle doesn't really exist.
You know, there's I have to say what you say reminds me of one, probably there are a few important intellectual figures that have really shaped my thinking, and definitely one of the most important is the one I find it more difficult to digest and also to accept that sometimes I agree with, is definitely Plato. Plato is such an interesting figure. He's so important, and I'm always worried to like Plato too much because of his transcendental view of things. So maybe we can use meaning as an example. The example we used a moment ago is perfect in this context. So we talked about meaning as being something that we grasp, a reality that lies beyond the language itself. This type of line of reasoning, according to some, is a very dangerous one, because it's the same view that Plato had when talking about the forms. Exactly, it's really an idealist view. It's the view, or at least he has the danger of running. It has the danger of running in that side of view, whereby in order to explain the reality of things, the reality of language, we evoke a reality that lies beyond it, and that can be regarded as a very dangerous move. And I understand why.
But why is it dangerous? I don't.
Well, because in order to explain the fact, you bring in an ontology that is not only not necessarily useful, but also largely unwarranted, abstract, that you cannot verify empirically. These are the risks you run. Okay. But the interesting thing is that the concept of transcendence is one that Plato also used dialectically. In fact, the large part of the theory of forms comes, not strangely, and is best expressed, including the very famous allegory of the cave, are from the Republic. Plato clearly had in mind a dialectic use of this, because for him, the goal of dialectic was transcending. And by that it meant that when me and you talked with one another and exchange dialectically our different opinions, the goal is not that I win and you lose, or the other way around, but the goal is that the solution is transcendental. It goes beyond our own positions in order to formulate a third position that actually encompasses all that there is that is good in both of us, in both of our position. And I've always been fascinated by this idea, and I've often wondered how really realizable it is in everyday practice. But to me, it has always been sort of a guiding star, if you want, when it comes to discussion, to scientific discussion, but also to discussion about whatever, really, rather than, just opposing my view to yours. See if we can transcend that divide into something that is more encompassing of all sides. It's utopic, as Plato would have, as expected from such a view, but
it's possible. I mean, if you assume, it's you have to be the only rigorous position is to be uncertain about it. Right?
Yes. So that you can find a Socratic sort of route in this type of which I very much like that we found it. I don't know. I don't want to be arrogant to the point of saying this is the way to go, but certainly you were mentioning today political arena. Certainly in today's world, it would be nice to see more of an attempt into this direction rather into that of conflict, for sure. If I had to decide between the two, out of the little evidence and the little capacity I have to make such a decision, I would certainly not lose conflict.
Yeah, and I think that point is really important, that it's not just the middle. It's not that once you put two positions that have some difference between them, you wind up in what you would superficially, by putting them side by side, what you would imagine in the middle. But
it
does create something new.
I'm glad that you say this, because when I make this point, I'm always worried to pass the idea that, to pass a more passive idea, an idea about being more passive about the world out there, that you don't need to take your stance, that, you can do without, that it's all just sitting down and contemplating and learning and that. And of course, that's not it. I mean, of course, you need to take your stand, and you really need to make your own decision, because that's what life is about, really. It's about the here and now, and you have to deal with it. But what you say really shows that it's not that, in a more profound sense, the goal really is to reach a higher ground and to reach it together. So it's not a passive process. It's a process that, through learning, through observing, through understanding, takes you somewhere. It's not... learning is never a passive activity. It's never something, you're never filled up with information without doing anything. It's only through engagement. So it is a way of engaging, after all.
Yeah, and of course, in order to not only to improve things, but also to preserve whatever is good about what you already have. For both things, you need action. So even just sitting down and thinking about things won't lead you anywhere. So I think that the important thing is that you have to be very careful of making sure that your action is right, that your action is good. And what happens if you assume that you're right at any point, that you at some point receive at some point develop some position on any topic, and then decide that will not change? What happens is that you're closing yourself to the possibility of learning. You're not accepting that you might be wrong
Absolutely.
about that one thing. So although you do have to act, you cannot just sit there and, because you will never have 100% certainty, never do anything. Yeah. Even in action, you can always accept the possibility of that you will make mistakes and that you can change them. That acting does not require being 100% permanently attached to the basis of your action.
Yeah. Well, it's plain impossible, in fact. Yes, I agree with you.
But it is very common for this to be the way one thinks about action, because you want to be certain, right? So you can just make the jump and say, I am certain, and take action, then just commit, and that's
very true. It's as I said, it's a very difficult balance of things, especially in this case. The world we live in does not allow us to be 100% sure of anything, and it's precisely for that reason that we need to reflect on it. It is for the same reason that you have to be careful with taking action, but then the fact that life is about actions, it's an inevitable fact, really. It's something you simply cannot do without. It is what it is. It's really, and there's for me the word action. It's an important one. We have already established it comes from. It has a very important Wittgensteinian roots, in fact, and it's one that became important for me more recently, especially in discovering that by exploring beyond language other systems of cognition, that the notion of an action, in fact, is much more rooted in our cognition than we tend to think. A very interesting example is that of perception. So how we perceive with our senses. Take the simply visual perception, that to have a very similar example, a very simple example. A classical view, which mainly we inherit from Aristotle, but especially these days from Descartes, is the view that our senses are registers of some sort of the reality that lies out there. So they are like photons. They are like they're like a camera. They record everything. These whatever it is record very passively and mechanically by reacting causally to the environment. Whatever is recorded is passed on to the mind, whatever is inside our brains. And what the mind does is to elaborate this information to give us more information, like, a three-dimensionality of the space we are observing, the fact that in this space there are objects. Some of these objects are people, some of other objects are things, some other objects are far away, some are close, different colors, and so on. This is not, we know from modern cognitive science that this is not the way it works. Our senses are nothing but this. What our senses do, in fact, from the most peripheral perceptors, is not to register information, but is to ask questions. A very important scientist in this respect is Marr, who died very young, unfortunately, but managed to publish his book on vision in 1982. Very important capstone in the way we understand vision today.
His book is titled On Vision?
It's titled Vision, I believe. I might be wrong because I'm always wrong with titles. But it's 1982. He died in 1980, I think, very young. So really a very bright mind. What he discovered is that the correct way to express the logic of vision is rather one of hypothesis testing. So what our receptors in our eyes do, since from the very receptors and upward to the more central cognitive system, the visual cortex and so on, is really to ask questions of the type: is there a certain property in my visual field? Is there a certain color? Are there vertical lines? Are there horizontal lines? And what the receptor does is not to give you a signal that correlates with the environment, but it's rather to give you a 1-0 signal that tells you whether there is or not that property in the environment. So you see, it's very, very different logic. It means that our senses are not here to register reality. They are here to ask questions about the world out there and gather information that they are set to gather, that they want to gather. They are there not just to record whatever, but really to select whatever the properties of the world out there that are useful for us. And you can ask, of course, why these and not other properties? Well, this is an answer you must find in evolution, in the way we have evolved, and our senses have evolved in order to provide us with information we really need. Not the one we don't need, not the one that would be redundant or useless for us, only the one that really serves us in our purpose.
There's just so much
of survival. There's just too much out there. So what they are filters after all. And what they perform, if you think very carefully about what's going on in this context, is that what our senses are performing is an action of data collection, in fact, that is hypothesis-driven, it's question-driven. It's not just a passive relation that we have with the world out there, but it's really purposeful. It's really meant to. This means that our cognition, from its very periphery, is in fact made of actions, of things that we do. It has much more to do with doing than it has with a more passive view of what our cognition should be. It's much more related to the world. So the notion of an action, I think, is in fact, I came convinced, is a very important primitive. It's a very important cognitive primitive, in fact. And I'm not surprised that we find it to become, the more and more we get to know ourselves as organisms endowed with a cognition, the more I see how the notion of action is becoming more and more important in domains such as that of learning and many aspects of cognition. So action is what we are, really. It's really what we do. It's an unavoidable part of the way we function from the foundations, really, of who we are and the way we interact with one another and with the world out there. So it's definitely something we cannot do without.
Well, that's fascinating. Our time here is almost over.
All right.
So I would ask so many questions, but really for now I just want to thank you for this conversation. It was very interesting. I actually think it was better than last time.
I'm sure.
That's going to be a treat for whoever listens. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Alberto, for this. It was a pleasure, of course.
This was Gaetano Fiorin, and we're off. Thank you for listening.